The United States is becoming increasingly polarized and radicalized. As this trend continues, institutions and politicians are content to cry about providing useful information, let alone delve into root causes. Combine this with a widespread ignorance of politics in general, and you've perfect conditions for the most harmful ideologies to take root. There's a definite need for education on the absolute basics of political ideology to dispel myths and misinformation, and to analyze the facts rather than uncritically consuming the rhetoric of those who benefit from the status quo. The goal of the first entry into the Right-Wing Extremism series is just that. This video will be split into 4 sections. 1. The left-right spectrum and its origins. 2. An exploration of the far right. 3. A brief threat analysis of far-right factions that exist today. And finally, number 4. The government response, and what ours should be. In the modern American parlance, liberal and conservative are most often used to describe the Democrats and Republicans respectively. Not only does this place implicit limits on political discussion, but it is utterly ahistorical. To understand the left-right spectrum, we must define what it even is and analyze its origins. The left-right spectrum is a method of categorizing political ideologies according to their stance on hierarchies. Those on the left promote egalitarianism and equality, while those on the right view hierarchies as necessary, inevitable, or even desirable. During the French Revolution, the National Assembly saw itself divided between 2 camps. Supporters of the revolution sat to the left of the presiding officer, while supporters of the monarchy sat to the right. As time went on, the left-right spectrum saw its usage spread through all of Europe by the 20th century. Now, due to the left and right being a spectrum, there exist ideologies and political parties in the far ends of said spectrum, hence the far and far right. Speaking of which, let's delve into the far right, specifically defining what it even is. First, let's give a cogent definition of the far right. We all know who's on the far right: MAGA types, white supremacists, constitutionalist militias, fascists, and more. But not everyone could tell you why. So, in 3 words, deference to hierarchy. Whatever hierarchy a member of the far right chooses as their base, be that religious sect, national identity, racial or ethnic heritage, historical or cultural tradition, is considered an absolute measure of worth. And this absolutist application creates in-groups and out-groups. Typically, this is combined with a victim narrative, where the in-group is being put down, not allowed to ascend to their proper position, by the out-group. It's this in-group versus out-group dynamic that is critical to far-right movements. Not because of its presence, that's just tribalism, but how extreme the application is along with the extra dodgy reasoning which separates far-right ideologies from other right-wing elements. The notable component of said reasoning is that the in-group not being dominant is seen as a deviation from the natural way of things, rather than an opinion many do not share. Fallacies and faith-based argumentation aside, this is covered in far more detail in the alt-right playbook. This is a primer, not a thesis. So to round things out, let's try to look at it from their perspective. 1. My in-group, and by extension myself, are supposed to be at the top. 2. This position isn't just an opinion, but a fact of nature due to insert bunk racial science and or ultranationalist rhetoric here. 3. My in-group currently isn't at the top. And finally 4. This is a deviation from the natural way of things, and it'd be a good thing for it to be reinstated. With a cogent definition of the far right, let's look at the actual political violence they've committed already. Some watching this may be more than familiar with far-right violence committed by neo-Nazis, anti-abortion activists, and other groups. But when it comes to official data, there's very little information. Thankfully, there exist groups that have collected the data. This analysis briefed by the CSIS is the most damning and informative. Here's the thesis paragraph. This analysis makes several arguments. First, far-right terrorism has significantly outpaced terrorism from other types of perpetrators, including from far-left networks and individuals inspired from the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda. Right-wing attacks and plots account for the majority of all terrorist incidents in the United States since 1994, and the total number of right-wing attacks and plots has grown significantly during the past 6 years. Right-wing extremists perpetrated 2/3 of the attacks and plots in the United States in 2019, and over 90% between January 1st and May 8th, 2020. For those of you who prefer graphs and maps, here's some. 1. Far-right terror isn't regional, it occurs everywhere in the United States. 2. Far-right terror has been a consistent problem, and our share of terror attacks and plots has seen consistent growth since 2014. Or 2011 with 2013 being an off year, up to you. 3. Far-right terror on its own, just from the sheer number of plots and attacks, is staggering. There's no argument to be had. Far-right terror makes up the majority of plots, attacks, and deaths per year. Most of that holds up prior to its meteoric rise too. Antifa holds no bearing on our current reality. Also, far-right terrorists tend to go after soft targets at an alarming rate, and many of those soft targets are from marginalized communities already facing oppression from the powers that be. However, if we're getting into the nitty-gritty like this, we might as well talk about who the big players and factions are in far-right spaces. We know that far-right terrorists are the ones causing the most havoc, so let's take a look at the factions that individuals and organized cells alike tend to align with. Now, tend to align is stated for a reason. Due to the prevalence of lone wolf and leaderless resistance models in far-right circles, having an entire organization actively committing paramilitary/terrorist activities as a united front is exceedingly rare. Rather, individuals will self-radicalize via social media, or even conventional media, and phantom cells will organize without much, if any, input from a larger group. Then they'll plan to commit acts of terror, or await the proper time, however they define it, to do so. This lessens the scalability of infiltration and makes conspiracies harder to disrupt. So, in lieu of pointing towards specific organizations besides serving as examples, looking at broad ideological tendencies that sometimes overlap is necessary for a who's who in gauging how much of a threat these factions pose. Trump and Kriegers. These are your hardcore Trump fanatics, so-called patriots straight from the cuckoo's nest. You know the type. Proto-fascist, likely deluded, and easily manipulated. However, they're also largely disorganized, so most conspiracies and attacks tend to be committed by particularly deranged and/or motivated individuals, with January 6th being a notable exception. The 2018 mail bomb campaign, the January 6th Capitol insurrection, and a grocery list of mostly smaller incidents are under their belt. Lumping the Proud Boys and Patriot Prayer in with the Trump and Kriegers isn't unwarranted, and their track record of violence needs little explanation. Generally militant and a vast recruitment pool makes them potentially dangerous, but not the most pressing threat. It's more of a pool of individuals that can potentially be threats rather than a collective one. Militia Movement V3. The militia movement has been around for quite some time. The first wave cropped up in the 90s in response to Ruby Ridge and Waco, which is understandable. The second wave then came to be after Obama's election, take a guess as to why. And then there's the militia movement of today, which could be considered the third wave. It doesn't have as much steam as its second wave, but it's much more frank with its goals, preparing for a second American Civil War or some other sustained period of civil unrest. The Civil War rhetoric is at its fever pitch with the Boogaloo Boys in particular, who've been implicated in multiple killings, police standoffs, and trying to play agent provocateur during the BLM protests. There's multiple videos of groups doing kill house runs in preparation for civil war or sustained periods of civil unrest. They mean social justice protests, of course. And then there's the conspiracies like planning to kidnap a governor. Even relatively mainstream, relative to the fringe right wing, groups like the Oath Keepers have had a shift towards Trump and Krieger rhetoric as well. Their leader and 10 others were indicted on seditious conspiracy charges this year, so the words are seemingly backed by action too. The Boogaloo Boys and third wave of the militia movement is rather recent, so one can't exactly quantify how dangerous they are, but they're well armed and, judging by the reaction to Rittenhouse, seem rather bloodthirsty. White supremacists and neo-Nazi accelerationists. Post 9/11, they have the highest body count, and unfortunately there's a renaissance of neo-Nazi terrorism. Popularized in the fascist forum Iron March, neo-Nazi accelerationism is rather simple. Initiate a race war and form a white ethno-state in the chaos. Iron March served as a stomping ground for the first modern neo-Nazi accelerationist group, at some Waffen division, members of which have committed multiple murders. Other groups sprang up with the same MO, such as the Base and various Waffen offshoots and chapters. All of them have committed, or plan to commit, acts of terror in the past, and openly laud racially motivated mass shooters like those that committed in Christchurch and El Paso. They often egg each other on in chat rooms too. No pretext, no justification, no smiling public face. Rather, they want a lot of the other people dead and aren't afraid to say it. Many of these groups are explicitly banned in multiple countries. Now, there's emphasis on multiple countries here, because on top of being the biggest threat, they also have international reach. There are active militant groups across North America, Europe, and allegedly South Africa. Basically combine the religious zealotry of religious fanatics with the racism and authoritarianism that's in vogue in the far-right mindset. Then add a few dashes of competency, given some of their members are active duty or veterans of NATO armed forces, and you've got the recipe for a clear and present threat. So, far-right terror is a problem, the most critical domestic terror threat, without question. What's the government done about it? Well, the Biden administration has actually reached out to non-government groups who research far-right extremism like the Anti-Defamation League, and allegedly are prioritizing domestic affairs rather than fear-mongering over geopolitical adversaries. Sounds like good news, right? Sure, but this is the Biden administration. Liberals in general have a penchant for having their hearts in the right place, but generally being ineffective. Not to mention what will likely come after: a Republican administration with hostile attitudes towards anti-terror authorities. Being skeptical of them is one thing. COINTELPRO exists after all. But when the Trump administration spent years sicking counter-terror authorities on Muslims and axing domestic terror task forces, it reveals a disturbing trend of ignoring real, observable threats and chasing imaginary ones. So, if we can't trust the state to stop far-right terror, at least long-term and at the root, what do we do? Simple. We need to defend our communities ourselves, and that starts with threat analysis and information gathering, which is what this series is all about. This series seeks to propagate anti-fascist ideas and concepts, go into deeper dives of far-right movements and their threat potential, and give actionable information to prevent far-right arguments from festering in those who haven't been inoculated against their talking points. We need to resist the far-right because no one is coming to save us. Rather, we must save ourselves.